Well, well, what has the cat dragged in today? It's an introduction to scriptable objects. Now, scriptable objects are a little bit of an odd duck in Unity. I would forgive you for not knowing that they exist because unless you have carefully read through the documentation online, or you've encountered a tutorial like this one that directly addresses them, there's nothing to indicate in the editor itself here that scriptable objects exist. They are code, you create them in C#, but if we come in here into the assets and go to create, we only see the option to create a C# script. There is no option in here to create a scriptable object. I can create shaders, I can create testing scripts, I can create playable scripts, but I can't create a scriptable object. It's an odd little oversight. Not entirely sure why they do that, especially considering that Unity seems to view scriptable objects as an important part of the engine. It is what it is. Who can understand some of the decisions they make sometimes? So what exactly are scriptable objects? Well, let's take a quick look at the official documentation. According to the official documentation, a scriptable object is a data container that you can use to save large amounts of data independent of class instances. One of the main use cases for scriptable objects is to reduce your project's memory usage by avoiding copies of values. And then they give a little example down here that I'm not a particularly large fan of, so I'm not going to go over it. So the general idea here is that a scriptable object stores data that is independent of a game object. And where this really comes into play is if you've got data that you either want to have exist as an asset, in other words, your data literally exists down here as an asset, or you want to avoid having numerous copies of information that's always going to be the same and is not going to change. For example, I have this scene here. I have a little green orc boy here, and a very angry Templar in black armor. No, I'm not making a reference. I have no idea what you're talking about. So, yeah, just one orc, though, to face one angry Templar in black armor. That's not particularly fair. So let's put a few more orcs in. So maybe instead of one, I have 5 orcs. Did I say 5 orcs? I meant 10 orcs. Although that's still a bit unfair. So maybe we want to have a 100 orcs, with apparently some of them hovering in midair. I get the point. The actual placement of these is not the point. The point is now I have 100 orcs. Each one of these orcs has this demonstration entity script on it that contains some stats that you might expect to have. And so as you can see from my labels here, I have some static values, strength, body, will, just sort of picked at random for the most part, and a calculated value, health. Now, these static values are going to be the same for every orc. Every orc's going to have strength, body, and will. Obviously, I don't want to go through and edit 100 orcs if I want to change these stats, and a prefab would take care of that quite nicely. Create an orc prefab. If I need to change these stats here, I can easily do so. It doesn't alter the fact that I have 100 copies of strength, 100 copies of body, 100 copies of will. That's a lot of information that's being wasted. This is 12 bytes worth of data here. Times 100 is 1.2K worth of data basically being wasted. That's not all that much, but let's project this forward. Instead of having 12 bytes of data that is identical amongst all of these orcs, I have, say, 240 bytes worth of data. Not an unreasonable number for an actual useful game object. And so it starts becoming an issue. Now, I'm very fond of the saying, early optimization is the root of all evil when it comes to programming, but that doesn't mean we ignore architectural issues like this. I know I don't need 100 copies of each of these integer values. I know that Unity gives me an easy way to avoid having those copies. I should take advantage of it. It does become an issue, not necessarily for running out of memory. We're pretty much past that problem for the most part. The main thing is when it comes to some really high-level memory optimizations, mainly trying to avoid thrashing the cache, as it's called, which is far beyond the scope of this video. So there are very good reasons as to why I do not want to have hundreds, maybe thousands even, copies of information that is not going to change. Enter the scriptable object. First, let's just take a quick look at the entity class. I mean, there's nothing jaw-dropping here. I just have my static values and my one calculated value. There's nothing going on here. Again, this is hyper-simplified so we can focus on the basic details of scriptable objects. And speaking of, here is the scriptable object that I'm going to use to replace that static stat block. I even included a little piece of extra information here, display name. So what is going on here? Well, as you can see, a scriptable object inherits from the scriptable object class. Again, there's no direct way to create this. So generally what I will do when I need a scriptable object is I will create a monobehavior script. And then after opening it up, I will change the inheritance from monobehavior to scriptable object, and then I'll delete out the start and update methods, usually just as a matter of course, because scriptable objects are not part of the update loop. They do not get the update message automatically. You would have to manually call into it. There's also no direct way for you to create a scriptable object asset. Even after we have this class, we're not going to really have any direct way to create it. And so you are going to want to add in this compiler directive here, this property, the create asset menu, give it what file name is it going to create by default, and how is it going to show up in the menu. So here I am specifying that it is the RPG system, and that the actual command is going to be create stat block, and order equals 1 places it up at the very top. So if I come back over here, right-click, create, you can see there it is. There's my RPG system. There's my create stat block. And then as far as code goes, it's business as usual. Now, like I said, this is not a mono behavior. It does not receive any of the various messages that a mono behavior will receive. But other than that, code it as you want. I mean, I've got reference to the Unity engine. I can attempt to reference the current scene and find game objects in it, etc., etc. Now, how I would actually use this, whoops, I do need to switch this over. So I am going to comment out these stats here, and I've apparently lost my block comment up there. Okay, that's strange. I will have to reset my UI later, it looks like. There we go. So now I've switched over to this scriptable object, and it's all I need to do to use it. You know, public stat so, because that's what I called my class. The variable name I want to use for it. And now my Angry Templar and my Orc have a slot here for putting in this specific type of scriptable object. Let's actually create that. So I'm going to right-click, create RPG system, create stat block, and there we go. You can see I now have a stat data asset. I will call this orc stats. Go to my orc, plonk that in there, and now my orc has the stats that I specify in this scriptable object. As you can see, it's data. I do like how they indicate to you that, yeah, this is really intended to be data. By the way, they've got the array curly brackets here. This is basically a data container that I can go in and set these values. You know, strength of 12, body of 5, will of 2. I mean, they're orcs. There we go. And now any orc that I assign this scriptable object to will have it. Couple of restrictions on scriptable objects. They are intended to be used in the editor. So they are assets, and as such, you cannot create an asset at runtime. So you can't dynamically create scriptable objects, or at least not cleanly, when it comes to runtime code. It is intended that the scriptable object has been created as an asset. It is in your assets folder, and it is used in the editor. As I mentioned before, these do not get the message pumps, the update, the on update, late update, fixed update, on trigger, enter, so on and so forth. None of those messages, they don't get them. And also, because this is an asset, yes, this will be obviously packaged up and distributed when I do a build, but users aren't going to have access to this. So that is something you need to consider. If you want your game to be highly moddable, you're probably going to want to avoid using scriptable objects as data containers for like items and other database type related issues, because your users aren't going to have easy access to it. So if you are looking to do, make your game highly moddable, that is a consideration. And let's take a quick look at a scriptable object that actually does something, because as it stands right here, this is kind of pointless. This is taken from another project, as that little comment there states. I literally can't put this into the project, otherwise things won't compile. But it's for a little prototype RTS that I did, and this is an event data, basically. I was using scriptable objects to hold events. So I defined this event orcs near, and I've got a various properties here that I can tweak. Can set sprite icons, warning messages, activation messages, to display to the user, and then a series of methods. It's important to note that awake, notice the color on this. This is not the automatically called version of awake. This is just a standard old method that whatever game object has this scriptable object has to manually call. And I have, timers that I can set, and then logic that it calls in. It goes through a callback system effectively to allow the scriptable object to talk back and forth with the main game. But the advantage of doing an event like this is now that I have this event data defined, I can create a couple different variations of this event fairly easily as data. And then in different levels of the RTS, I can apply this data to the events. Put it in a timeline, so it gets turned, the game object gets turned on after a certain amount of time to control when the events fire, so on and so forth. So they are useful. There is one other drawback, however, and this drawback is going to lead into the next video. And that if I select my orc, I no longer see my stats here. If I want to see my stats, and if I want to edit the stats, I have to come over here and select the scriptable object in the asset database over here. So I have to select orc stats. Now I can see them and edit them. But if I select it here, all it shows me is the scriptable object. And I also need to make sure that I can link up between this and the health, so that way the health is calculated. And since the health value needs to be calculated from the stats, I don't actually want this to be editable. I don't want a designer to be able to come in here and enter in a health value. That's not how it works. The health value is determined by the stats. So how do we control that? Well, that is a custom inspector and is also the next video. As always, if you found this video informative or at least mildly entertaining, a thumbs up would be appreciated. And if not, well, that is life, I suppose, and the thumbs down button is right next to it. Until the next video.